Join James Tambalebi for Ask the Expert.
Hello, and welcome to the program Ask the Expert. This week's topic will be climate change with particular focus on induced risk management in the coastal zones of Sierra Leone. And to help me expand on that, I have as my expert Dr. Raymond Johnson, Senior Lecturer in Oceanography, Department of Marine Biology, Forabe College, University of Sierra Leone. My understanding of the concept climate change is limited to the notion that it is any significant long-term change in the expected patterns of average weather of a region or the whole Earth over a significant period of time. Climate change is about abnormal variations to the climate and the effect of these variations on the other parts of the Earth. Dr. Johnson, let's start with an expert definition of the concept climate change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. You've just given an expert definition of climate change. Well, notwithstanding, when we talk of climate change, we do not look at the natural variations in climate or weather patterns, which is indeed the definition for climate change. But when we talk of climate change within the context of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we are looking at the human induced changes to climate. So, in fact, we say climate change is a change in climate due to human activities, due to human intervention. That's if we look at the anthropogenic aspect of climate change. And that is why we keep talking about, for instance, change caused by increasing concentration of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, causing global warming and hence climate change. These are all human aspects or human activities that contribute to climate change. So that is why the definition has been modified to pay emphasis on the human activities.
So this brings me to causes of Earth climate to change. What are the causes?
Yes, as I said earlier, they are natural causes. The Earth's climate has been changing over, given what we call a cyclic period, 11,000 years, which we call the Milankovitch cycle, changes in the melting and freezing of ice, which we call the different ice ages, and so on. These are natural changes to climate change. Also climate change may be caused by changes in what we refer to as sunspot activity. You see, the radiation intensity of the sun can change over time, and that could cause also climate change. But these are natural causes. My second definition, which I focus on, the changes attributed to human activity, is what is now the mainstay for climate change. That is the increase in concentration of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as a result of the following: the way we use energy. Coal burning, for instance, is one of the causes for increased carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Essentially, the use of fossil fuel. When I say fossil fuel, I mean oil, gas, coal, those natural sources of energy which we have been using over time. Fossil-based fuels, the burning of these fossil fuels is mainly the cause for climate change. Apart from that, we have the way we manage our waste. Waste management is another cause for climate change. The way we manage our waste, if they are not properly handled, burning of waste, and that is another cause. What we refer to as incineration of waste is also a cause for climate change. Any activity that increases the emission of the so-called greenhouse gases, which is characterized by carbon dioxide. When I say greenhouse gases, it's a number of gases. You have methane, you have oxides of nitrogen, you have the volatile elements, you have the chlorofluorocarbons. All these are gases that increase the warming of the earth. Also, land use cover change. What do we mean by land use cover change? The earth initially was made up of forests, but as we expand industrial activity, we build cities, we build towns, we deforest, as it were, we reduce the forest cover, hence the word land use land cover change. Reducing the forest cover means we are reducing the sinks that would be responsible for absorbing excess carbon from the atmosphere, and hence we are enhancing global warming and hence climate change. Also industrial activities, the factories we build in order to produce our goods and services, the industries, all of them during their working activity, they emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere during their productive cycles. And any activity thus that enhances the increase in greenhouse gases into the atmosphere enhances global warming and hence climate change.
You're listening to Ask the Expert with James Tamba Leby.
Wow, this is breathtaking. Let's move on to climate change induced risk. What's that about?
That's quite interesting. Climate change induced risk. Again, the human factor becomes very, very crucial in this aspect. I've already highlighted some aspects of the climate change induced risk. Because of our activities, burning of fossil fuel, our consumption patterns, deforestation, expansion of our cities, building of factories, we are inducing the risk of climate change. What are these risks?
So you're saying every man-made activities that has the tendency to affect the climate is an induced risk?
It is. Let me give you an example. When we say climate change, what are the indicators of climate change? Increase in global temperature. Now, when global temperatures increase, what happens? The ice caps in both hemispheres, both the northern and southern hemispheres, Arctic and Antarctic region, undergo increased melting, and hence the volume of water entering the oceans would increase in the first place. And the first areas where those increases are manifested are along coastal areas. Coastal areas are areas of the world that border on the ocean. All countries that border on the ocean are regarded as coastal countries.
So Sierra Leone has a large coastal area indeed?
Yes, Sierra Leone is a coastal state because it's bordered by the Atlantic Ocean. So, and then what happens? When the temperature of the earth increases, the weather patterns become erratic. Flooding, increased storm activity, hurricanes, cyclones, and so on and so forth. Tropical cyclones become more active, bringing a lot of devastation and destruction of lives and properties to coastal areas lying along the coast.
So coastal states are more at risk than other states, landlocked states?
Precisely. Coastal states are more vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change than landlocked states. Although to some extent, because even the landlocked states have their own share of climate change impacts. Now this risk of, for instance, flooding and inundation, risk of drought, risk of sea level rise, these are the risks that could be, as it were, assisted by human activity. One example, now when you, along the coastal areas, remove the barriers to, for instance, storm surges at sea, that is when the sea level rises as a result of storm surge. You remove the natural barriers. What are these natural barriers? These are sand dunes. These are mangrove forests. These are other coastal vegetation along the coast that will tend to dampen the aggressive nature of the sea. When you remove those barriers, you are inducing the risk of climate change. That is, as it were, you are assisting the process of the impacts of this climate change activities, like sea level rise, for instance, and increased coastal erosion.
So let's move on to the management of this induced risk. Basically, what is it about? Climate change induced risk management.
Normally, when you are faced with problems of climate change, essentially, let us take, for example, rising sea level along coastal areas, which is one of the major problems. There are three approaches. You either fight, if you have the strength to fight and the wherewithal. You either flee or you adapt. Now, for instance, if a storm is approaching a particular state, storm warnings have been issued. One way of adaptation is to have a robust early warning system. An early warning system which, as it were, warns people that trouble is approaching. And that is one way of adapting a strong early warning system. That early warning system provides the government or the state with the capacity or opportunity to warn its citizens to leave areas that are likely to be impacted very seriously by the effects of this phenomenon. You could recall that when, for instance, storms are approaching the eastern coast of the United States, California, Florida, and so on, and other parts of the world, you would see...
And these are all coastal states.
And these are all coastal areas. You will hear that warnings have been issued to people to evacuate, to move to high ground, maybe 2-3 days before the arrival of the storm, because of the fact that it is quite understood the impact that that storm is going to have on the residents of those areas and on lives and property. So the early warning system, there's robust meteorological forecasts, or hydrometeorological forecasts in those states where hydrometeorology is also highly developed, provides the state with the opportunity to provide early warning to the citizenry and to those carrying activities in the coastal area for their own safety and security. That is one. Another approach is education and sensitization. You allow coastal dwellers to understand the possible impact of climate change on their lives, so that when planning is being carried out even by the state will be able to plan in such a way that it would minimize the adverse effects of climate change in coastal areas. So planning is another important tool.
So you have named two. One is early warning signs, and the second is
planning. Planning is part of adaptation.
Adaptation.
Yeah, and of course the other aspect is, and I've mentioned also, education.
And public education.
Public education. Mm-hmm. When we say adapt, for instance, in areas where there has been massive deforestation, for instance, the mangroves, which is common to us and near to us in Sierra Leone, you can now carry out replanting schemes to reforest those areas because they serve as like storm barriers. Okay. They help weaken the storms before they get to areas where they could carry out trouble. The same goes for the sand dunes. When sea level rises and storm surges occur, storm surges is a sudden uplift of the sea level, and of course this may cause flooding and inundation in wider areas. The sand dunes protect the other aspect, the coastline behind it from such devastation. And so when intensive sand extraction destroys those sand barriers, as it were, just like if you have flood, you see people putting bags of sand to protect their house. So this is the natural barriers. So when you remove them, you are, as it were, inducing the risks.
You're listening to Ask the Expert with James Tamba Leby.
Okay, let's talk about the impact of climate change on both human health and animals.
Well, I will just refer my listeners to the heat wave in Europe. The heat wave in Europe is essentially as a result of climate change. We too experience short-term bursts of high temperature. And of course, you would imagine what will be the impact. Heat waves in Europe cause substantial loss of life. It was recorded not long ago in France in particular. There was substantial loss of life as a result of heat. Even up to, I think, in recent times, maybe last week or so, they're expecting another heat wave. That is one glaring example of the impact of climate change on human health. Now, in tropical areas, like where our country is situated, high temperature, just try and notice, high temperature always leads to an increase in mosquito appearances.
Oh, okay.
So, which means that increased high temperature may lead to increasing mosquito activity, which of course carry malaria, not only malaria, parasite, but other parasites, which we now know, maybe things like dengue fever. There was another illness which was recently attributed to mosquitoes, which causes abnormal growth in children. You remember in the case of Mexico, Zika virus, things like that. And it can also
Argentina, Brazil.
Exactly. And it can also lead to the emergence of viruses which we hitherto have not identified. Okay. So this is one threat of climate change to health, you see. And of course, the proliferation of these hitherto known and unknown viruses is a clear indication that the climate is changing. Don't forget that when the climate is changing, it enhances the appearances of different species or enhances the resilience of species already existing. So this could be a serious threat. So we have to take climate change very seriously.
You are listening to Ask the Expert with me, James Tambalebi, and the topic is climate change with particular focus on induced risk management and adaptation. And my expert is Dr. Raymond Johnson, Senior Lecturer in Oceanography, Department of Marine Biology, Furabi College, University of Sierra Leone. Now, is there any nexus between climate change and coastal zones? What's the nexus?
I mentioned that coastal zones are areas that lie adjacent to the ocean. So obviously when there's change in climate and resulting in mainly sea-based activities like storm-generated waves, that is one. It may also lead to high levels of sea level. I mentioned that earlier. These are basically the main, as it were, impacts of climate change on the coastal areas as a result of global warming. Now, the coastal areas are more vulnerable because of their location, because of their location to the sea. I mentioned that quite clearly. So, and we need to worry about coastal zones, how to manage them, because along the coastal zones live almost 60% of the world's population.
Is it because of fishing activities?
I just wanted to tell you because, one, not only for fishing activity, the coastal zone is a very rich area. The aspect of oil and gas is very important. Communication, sea transport, and of course fishing, of course, is a very important activity along the coastal area. Even take Sierra Leone as an example, a typical example. We have over 200 villages along the coastal area. You see? So, obviously, if there is serious activity resulting from climate change, because this is what we are talking about, for instance, flooding, storm surges, and so on, it will be a problem. Take the Philippines, for example, what happened in the last storm surge, resulting from tsunamis.
Tsunami, yeah.
The devastation, the amount of people who lost their lives. But if, for instance, as I mentioned, there was an early warning system.
Indonesia.
Indonesia. If there was an effective, robust early warning, even when they have an early warning system, the systems were not able to provide adequate information for those sudden changes that may occur. You see? Okay.
So now let's talk about the need or the benefits for adaptation. Why do we need to adapt, or why do we have to manage the induced risk? What are the benefits?
The benefits of adaptation are huge because man has been adapting to adverse conditions over the years. How do we adapt is probably the question. Do we adapt as using policies and sound regulations? Yes. That is also one form of adaptation. For instance, when you have a sound coastal zone policy or regulation in place that says, for instance, do not build houses within a certain distance to the sea, that's already a proactive adaptation strategy. It will save lives and property. You identify vulnerable zones of erosion, for instance. Take Laka, for instance. You go I want to use glaring example. Just go to Laka and see properties that have been lost to the sea because of poor coastal zone planning. If there was proper coastal zone planning in place, whosoever is building his or her property should have known that so many years ago the sea was at that point. Go to Aberdeen Creek. Go to Aberdeen. Go to the creek. You see where the stunted mangroves are. That tells you that seawater was getting up to those areas. So the water may have receded to some extent, but have not forgotten where it was. So during periods of storms or changes in weather pattern, the tendency for the sea to come to those original positions is very possible. So you can use those areas as zones of demarcation, as examples to say, beyond this point, no housing construction. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So are those the only benefits?
The other benefits of adaptation is that one, it helps us, it strengthens us, it increases our resilience. Okay. What do I mean by resilience? Economic poverty is a vulnerability. In many countries which are rich and better in terms of economic status than ours, when there is problem, you respond easily. People, as it were, regain their property, regain their lives, they rebuild their lives quickly. And those countries are able to provide facilities to adapt to climate change. But for us, and why we need to adapt is because we cannot mitigate. What do I mean? Let me distinguish between the two. Now, what is happening in the world all over? You see people talk about electric cars. Mm-hmm. Also, atomic driven energy schemes and so on. These schemes tend to reduce the use of fossil fuel, the dependency on fossil fuel. Number two, what do? They tend to, as it were, reduce not only the dependency on fossil fuel, but those mitigation measures also help to stem people's activity in moving to what we call non-renewable resources. That's what they're trying to do. So they use technology to mitigate climate change. Here, what do? Say plant trees. That's to increase the sinks for the carbon dioxide, for the greenhouse gases. The trees serve as sink. The ocean also serves as sink. We say don't pollute the ocean because that would reduce its capacity to absorb carbon dioxide and so on. But the most important thing for the adaptation, there are certain adaptation practices to build, for instance, seawalls to protect the coast from the high waves. But do you have the money to build those seawalls?
Thank you very much for talking to me. You've been listening to Ask the Expert with James Tambalebi, and the topic and the discussion was climate change with particular focus on induced risk management, especially in coastal zones. My expert has been Dr. Raymond Johnson, Senior Lecturer in Oceanography, Department of Marine Biology, Forabe College, University of Sierra Leone. Keep listening.
Tune into Radio Mount Orel, FM 107.3 every Monday after the 8 p.m. news bulletin and on Saturdays after the 7 a.m. news bulletin for Ask the Expert.